Welcome to Lucid Horizon. This is a show in which we talk about technology, science, humanity, and politics. In this episode, we have a treat for you. We have Mr. Laban Coblintz, the Director of Communication of ITER project. It's an amazing project. It's an amazing science, engineering, and technology project, which is, I think, meant to change the course of history of energy production on this planet. And I will let Mr. Coblintz tell you the details of our story today. And with that, I bring you Mr. Coblintz. Thank you very much, Laban, for accepting our invitation, and welcome to the show.
Thank you, Aliyar. It's a pleasure to be here.
Right off bat, could you tell us what is ITER and what are the significance of ITER as a mean of introduction?
Sure, thank you. I will start with the word ITER, because in the original conception of this word some decades ago, the title of the experiment was International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor. That's how you got the acronym. And that goes back all the way to shortly after a 1985 agreement between Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan, when they were trying to do something about reducing their nuclear weapons arsenals and really starting that East-West dialogue. And they wanted to do something positive, and this project was conceived. But over time, the word has changed because, and we no longer use that spelled out acronym, although you will see it, journalists use it from time to time, because of the word thermonuclear and the confusion that sometimes exists between fission nuclear and military nuclear, meaning atomic bombs, and hydrogen fusion, which is also a nuclear reaction, but somewhat different. We'll get into all of that, but more recently, we have stuck with the Latin meaning for ITER, which is the way. And we like to think of ITER as the way in the sense of being a model for international collaboration. The project is a convergence by 35 countries to build the largest hydrogen fusion device ever made as an experimental device to study and to study physics phenomenon that we have not been able to do so far, that will pave the way for the fusion commercial machines that follow. So it is actually the first ever. There have been hundreds of tokamaks built, but it is the first industrial scale fusion device.
Thank you very much for that very simple and comprehensive introduction. So ITER is not a new power plant, but a scientific experiment that, if successful, could prove the viability of fusion as a clean energy source. Could you tell us what is the difference between fission and fusion, and why fission is so much better than fusion?
Sure. I know you have quite an educated audience. I don't need to go too deeply into the physics to explain this, but in their simplest version, fission and fusion are two natural phenomena that each are illustrations of Einstein's famous equation, E equals mc squared, in which a tiny bit of matter is converted into a large amount of energy. All of the existing nuclear power plants in the world, more than 400, are fission plants. So let me first talk about the difference in what happens in fission and fusion. In a fission plant, normal size, same size as say 1,000 megawatt, one gigawatt energy electricity generation plant, you have several hundred tons of a very heavy substance like uranium, most often, or plutonium, or a mix, in which, and the reaction consists of a neutron hitting at a certain speed, hitting that heavy nucleus like uranium and splitting it. And in that split, you produce daughter products, but you also produce a certain amount of a burst of neutrons, additional neutrons that are quote fast, meaning that they are highly energetic. And the energy, the energy is more, the mass is slightly reduced in the sum of these daughter products, and the energy is slightly higher. That's E equals mc squared. So a little more about fission. Fission then is a chain reaction. Those neutrons that are produced in fission give their excess energy as heat to water, which produces steam, which will drive turbines and produce electricity. But as those neutrons slow down, they create more fission. So in other words, they bombard another uranium nucleus, so you have a chain reaction. That's a really critical thing to understand about fission, because if I start to compare the differences between fission and fusion, one of them has to do with safety, both as it is real and as it is perceived. So the fission reaction, being a chain reaction, means that the operator has to maintain a certain degree of quote, quote, poisons to slow it down, or additional input to speed it up, so that will remain, that chain reaction will remain at a point that's called critical. If it's subcritical, you're not going to get electricity. If it's supercritical, you end up with what could be a runaway reaction, which has got to be cooled very, very rapidly, or it could lead to a meltdown, an accident like at Chernobyl or Fukushima or 3 Mile Island. So how is that all different from fusion? Remember that I said it's still E = mc squared, but in fusion, you take the very, very lightest element, hydrogen, two isotopes, two variants of hydrogen. One of them, in a normal hydrogen nucleus, you have just a proton, and in deuterium, you add 1 neutron. In tritium, still hydrogen, but you add 2 neutrons. So in fusion, you're not splitting anything, you're colliding it. You collide a deuterium and a tritium nucleus together at very, very high speeds, because now they're both positively charged. If you have an ionized nucleus separated from its electron, you have 2 positively charged particles that normally would not be able to join. So they have to be done at very, very, very high speeds. Now, in the sun and in all the stars, fusion occurs because of gravitation, because of the density at the center of these big balls of hydrogen. So that's what the sun is. And in fact, fusion is the most common form of energy in the universe. It's why we're here today. It is why we are alive. It is the source of all light and heat on Earth. It is what makes our Earth habitable. So the fusion occurring at the heart of the star is using hydrogen that is so dense. It's the magnitude, the weight, the mass of the sun is about 300,000 times that of Earth. So the hydrogen at the core of the sun is about 70 times the density of normal steel. So these hydrogen, deuterium, tritium, these nuclei are pressed together very, very hard. That's how they work. We can't do that on Earth. So fusion on Earth, getting back to the reactor, something that we generally call a tokamak. A tokamak is a word, a Russian word that stands for toroidal shape, like a donut, magnetic coils. And with magnetic confinement fusion in a tokamak, we actually only have 2 to 3 grams of fuel. Remember I said fission had 200 to 300 tons of fuel, right? So several 100,000 kilos. In the fusion tokamak, you only have 2 to 3 grams. And as these nuclei collide, the same thing in a certain way happens in the sense of E = mc squared, because a tiny portion of that incoming 2 forms of hydrogen, that incoming mass, is converted to energy. But actually the fusion reaction is about 4 times more energetic than the fission reaction. So the neutron is again, 1 neutron comes off of this reaction, and the rest of it combines to make a non-radioactive helium nucleus. The helium nucleus, well, the incoming deuterium and tritium have an energy of about 0.7 mega electron volts. For those of you who understand those engineering terms, the outgoing helium nucleus has an energy of about 3.5 mega electron volts. So it's 5 times more energetic than the incoming, and the neutron coming away is over 14 mega electron volts. So that means 20 times more powerful. That's the energy translated from the slight loss of mass. And that, to put it in metaphoric terms, that neutron is so fast that if released in free space, it would reach the moon in about 8 or 9 seconds. So that neutron will impact the metal wall of the tokamak and translate its kinetic energy like a bullet hitting a steel wall. It will translate, if you felt that afterward, the bullet would stop, but the wall would be very hot. So the neutron transfers its kinetic energy as heat, and the water circulating behind the wall then is heated up and will, of course, go on to make just like with a fission plant, or for that matter, an oil or gas electricity plant, it will go on to make steam to make electricity, to drive a turbine and make electricity. Now, back to this fission fusion comparison. Remember everything I said about fission. Those the split when something is no longer uranium, but is something like xenon or krypton or other things as it decays, that eventually becomes waste. Unless you decide you're going to reuse, that eventually translates into waste. And that waste becomes a tens of thousands of year legacy. It needs to be monitored because it is highly radioactive and very long-lived. The decay of that waste takes many years. With fusion, you do not have that equivalent. Your products are non-radioactive helium, not hazardous in any way, although it will continue to heat the plasma. We'll talk about that. And the neutron. And so in effect, what we make from that, we put lithium in the walls of the tokamak so that those neutrons not only transfer heat, but will also make tritium. So they're actually creating our fuel, sending more fuel in. So the waste from fusion will be both tritium, which in fact we will maintain the tritium system as leak tight as possible because we want to reuse that as fuel. It's not waste, it's just more fuel. But you will have some waste that will, where the tritiated materials, for example, or the materials that become radioactive in the actual metal of the tokamak will become radioactive because it's bombarded with neutrons. So from that standpoint, sure, you will have waste, a much smaller amount of waste from a fusion plant, but it is all relatively short-lived. So first of all, it's much less in volume. Secondly, if you left a tokamak simply stay in place for 100 years, you could recycle the metal because it would no longer be radioactive. It would no longer be lethal. So waste is a big contrast. The reaction itself is a big contrast. If I simply unplug the device somehow, it shuts down. There is no buildup. There's no chain reaction in fusion. And so there's no buildup of what fission people call decay heat, which must be removed by cooling water or another coolant, or else in a fission reactor, you will get the meltdown. You cannot create a nuclear accident in the Chernobyl, Fukushima style, a meltdown accident. You cannot do that with a fusion plant. You could conceivably have distortion of the shape of the magnetic field, and you could hurt the machine itself in minor or major ways. But that would not result in a radioactive release. It would not result in a meltdown. So I've talked about those two advantages. The other advantage is that the fuel for fusion is really in water. That's the deuterium can be extracted directly from water. And you can also extract the secondary fuel, which is lithium, which then will breed tritium. And lithium is abundant in the Earth's core. So in addition to all of that, your fuel costs are very, very low from fusion. So advantages over fission, similar reaction, but safe. I would argue more economic. We can get to that later. Abundance of fuel, virtually unlimited supply for really hundreds of millions of years. And the economics, I think, are much better and without the waste problem. So that's a very long answer, but that illustrates your differences between fission and fusion.
Those are very important points and very important distinctions between fusion and fission. But you know, we know that there's been many efforts in the last 7 years since we knew about fusion, and the fusion science has been hot in the last 7 years. As you said, the name tokamak is actually a Russian word that was developed back in the 1950s and 60s when the Russians started working on the fusion reactors. But along all this time, we have not been very successful so far as what makes the difference in between the fission and fusion. We knew that the distinction, but we weren't actually able to make a reactor that will establish as a model for the future commercial power plants. I know that your plant is not a power plant, but what makes ITER different from the past attempt?
Sure. To be honest, the biggest thing is size. When you look at the implications of size for a tokamak, it's quite profound. There is a comic strip that also became a movie called Iron Man, in which Iron Man puts a tokamak in his chest. That is his power. I don't know if you've ever heard that. But to be honest, that's not realistic, because you need a certain size in order for a tokamak to be effective. The primary measurement parameter of a nuclear fusion, a hydrogen fusion plant, which is also embedded in the ITER mission, relates to a single letter called Q. Q is the ratio in plasma physics of the output heating, the output thermal power that you will get from the plasma, with the denominator being the input thermal power needed to heat the plasma. So at ITER, we can express our entire mission in an equation, Q greater than or equal to 10. So that means that in our plasma pulses, we want to get 500 megawatts or more of thermal power out for about 50 megawatts of heating in. And we will have a capacity to raise that heating input and a capacity to do a higher output, but that's our pulsed power goal. To get to that, all of the other tokamaks that you referenced, there has never been even a Q of 1. In other words, which sounds very dispiriting, we have never been able to get more energy out than in. But what we do have is all of the data showing that the larger you make the tokamak, the volume of the vacuum vessel that houses the fusion plasma, the larger you make it, the greater the curve goes. Now, there are actually 3 factors. One is the strength of the magnetic field, which in ITER will get to 12 in the very center of the central solenoid, that the central magnet, about 13 Tesla. But ultimately, you're going to be putting a field of 11 to 12 Tesla, which for those of you who are not familiar, that's 380,000 times the Tesla of the Earth's magnetic field, if that gives you so it's a very concentrated magnetic field. So the field strength of the Tesla, the density, the plasma density, and the size, the actual volume, are directly influencing. Those are the 3 things that influence Q. So the largest tokamak to date, which was a European tokamak built by Eurofusion, it's called the Joint European Torus. It's next to Oxford, near the town of Colham in England. JET, for an input heating power of 23 megawatts of heat, it produced a 16 megawatt output. So really about 0.67. That was its Q. ITER will have as its goal both that greater than or equal to 10, as well as it will need to, we have the goal of averaging the pulses so that we get to a more or less steady state, so that from the actual heating that you're feeling in the walls and in the heating cooling systems, you will be feeling a relatively steady state that corresponds to a Q of 5. Now, we could have made that much larger. The reason we make it the size that we do is that we are trying to get to a phenomenon called a burning plasma. And a burning plasma means that you can think of it as a self-heating or largely self-heating plasma. What it means is that the neutrons coming off and specifically the helium atom or the helium molecule nucleus that I said will come off of the fusion reaction at 5 times the energy of the incoming particles. when you get that helium nucleus will go on to continue to heat the plasma. It's transferring its heat until it just loses its heat and it drops down to the bottom of the reactor, of the tokamak. So the result is, as that helium is continuing to heat the plasma, when you get to the point that more than 50% of your heat is coming actually from the fusion reaction itself, rather than from external heating systems, cyclotrons and gyrotrons and so forth. So instead of that, it's coming now from the fusion reaction itself. When you get to more than 50% self-heating, that's what we call a burning plasma. And you can get to a higher point called ignition, at which you don't need to do anything more than just continue to feed fuel. So we know about burning plasmas, but a plasma physicist's ability to study that is at the distance of the center of the sun, or in the microsecond from an H-bomb. So nobody has ever been able to do a useful study of a burning plasma. And in order to shape the commercial machines that follow, ITER is built to a size where it will both demonstrate the industrial scale feasibility of fusion for peaceful purposes, and it will also allow scientists from all over the world to study the burning plasma phenomenon and then to optimize subsequent machines based on their results.
So I understand that burning plasma, as its core, has a temperature of 150 to 300 million degrees centigrade, and so this is an amazing capability of being able to produce 150 million degrees of centigrade. I mean, that's a huge temperature. The temperature that doesn't allow any object, any element, any alloy, any metal on Earth to stay solid, and it will melt anything. But still, this marvel of technology and engineering that you have achieved in ITER, you've been able to isolate that core temperature from the vessel walls using magnetic fields, obviously using very strong magnetic fields, to achieve this amazing capability, and basically separating the heat from the core that is really an unmanageable temperature. You've been able to manage that amazing temperature. And you mentioned in passing that ITER has brought some 35 countries to participate in this very impressive international partnership. Given that there has never been such partnership between countries like the US, China, Russia, the EU, India, Japan, South Korea, and other countries who are participating, to demonstrate the feasibility of a scientific principle that could lead in the development of a commercial product. What aspect of ITER has been so attractive to these very different countries to encourage them to chip in financially and scientifically and with the resources to build a fusion reactor?
It's a great question, thank you. And the short answer that some would give is that at least at its start, none of these countries, not even the massive power, the industrial power of the United States, or the futuristic work that Russia has done, or others, none of them probably could have done this on their own. But there's a better answer to that. Every country that is involved in ITER, so all of the European Union, including because the European Union has its membership in ITER through Euratom, and so Switzerland and the UK have their membership also through Euratom. Actually, following Brexit, the UK is still finalizing its agreement to get back into Euratom, but we have continued to have the UK folks helping here on the site. So the Europe, and then China, India, Japan, South Korea, Russia, and the United States are all members. Each of those countries, to a more or less defined extent, has its own vision, its own fusion roadmap. But for each country to make an industrial scale device that was not going to produce electricity, but was actually going to be used as an experimental facility, was not a practical situation. ITER is expensive enough to do. That's one part of it. But the other part is also, if you look at who is actually doing the work here, you have the top companies from all over. You've got China with their giant consortium of ASIP and SWIP. You have companies like General Atomics in the US. Actually, you have, I think, 600 contracts in the US in 44 states plus the District of Columbia. In Korea, it's Hyundai Heavy Engineering. In India, it will be companies like Larsen & Toubro or Tata. In Japan, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. You know, you have these top, Rosatom in Russia. You have these top companies and organizations, technical powerhouses that are all doing pieces, partly because they all want their companies to have the advanced technology that goes into ITER, but partly because the engineering challenges are severe. Aliyar, you were mentioning very rightly the temperature of the plasma. I mean, we have had before in smaller tokamaks, to be fair, we have had the ability to get up to those temperatures, even higher temperatures. Not that that is necessarily necessary, that is really necessary, because for the approximate temperature at which, you know, at a subparticle level, temperature equates to velocity. So what you're looking for is a velocity at which these particles will overcome their repulsion and combine and fuse and produce the fusion reaction. So that velocity translates loosely to about 150 million degrees Celsius, but you'll have some variation in that because obviously you're heating the overall volume, which in jet, as what I had mentioned before, the previous largest one was about 80 cubic meters, whereas in ITER the plasma volume is more than 800 cubic meters. So a large volume, and you're also very, very correct. We need to confine that. We need to create, with a series of magnetic systems, we need to create a magnetic field that is precisely attuned to the shape of the tokamak. So inside the metal of the walls, you have a precisely configured invisible magnetic field that is in fact holding the charged particles, the deuterium and tritium nuclei in the ionized plasma, as well as the electrons, away from the walls, but allows the non-charged, the neutrons with no charge, which means that they will escape the magnetic field. It allows them to exit and transfer their energy. So the engineering feats are, one might say, not just amazing, but almost insane, because the superconductor material, in order to get that incredibly high tech, Tesla strength, the superconducting material that we are using is niobium tin, niobium titanium, which means that has to be, in order to be superconducting, meaning that in the customary electrical equation, the ohms, the resistance, is reduced to zero. An electron can flow completely freely through those magnets, through those materials. To do that, it's a superconductor that has to be cooled to minus 269 degrees, about 4 Kelvin, 4 degrees above absolute zero. So you've got, at a certain point here in this tokamak, you've got in the central magnet, in these magnets, in these circular magnets, you've got a temperature that is of the order of interstellar space, that cold. And just a few meters away, you've got the plasma at 150 million degrees, you know, one of the hottest points in the universe. So that says that the better answer to why did all of these countries agree to come together and build ITER as a single unit was not only because arguably no one country could do that on its own at the start, but also because it was a convergence of all of these countries' roadmaps. Every country roadmap leads through ITER to the commercial machines that will follow. And their sense of urgency, their energy needs, their engineering and scientific preferences may lead to divergent pathways afterward. But in that way, all roads go through ITER.
That's remarkable. Those numbers are very impressive. You know, so we know that the temperature at the center of the sun is very close to the temperature of the core burning, plasma burning core of the tokamak reactors, 150 million degrees centigrade. And you bring the 150 million degrees centigrade to right next to it, you have a device, a superconducting magnet that's operating at the temperature of the interstellar space, which is the coolest temperature in the universe. You know, even the universe has not been able to do this, because in the universe we have stars where the temperature is very high, millions of degrees of centigrade at the core, but you don't have interstellar temperature immediately a meter or 10 meters or 20 meters away from the core, from these 150. In other words, actually, if you look at the temperature on Earth, which is hundreds of millions of kilometers away from the sun, the temperature on Earth sometimes can get up to very uncomfortably high temperatures. So it's, you know, and in order to really, around the stars, to get to interstellar temperature, you have to really get very, very far from the stars in order to go to from 150 million to 4 degree Kelvin, which is the boiling temperature of the liquid helium required for the superconducting magnets. That is really a marvel of engineering and technology, and I'm so delighted to see that, you know, 35 countries have come together to do this. But we know that it's not really made to make electricity. It's not, in other words, it's not a power plant, but it's actually a research device. So what can it do that justifies the enormity of effort in terms of cost, human resources, and international priority that it has received from participating countries, which are otherwise, you know, these countries, the one that you named, these 35 countries, are usually in a fierce economic, military, and ideological competition, but now they've come together on this particular project that is not even a power plant, it's actually a research lab. So what are they hoping to get out of that? I mean, I know you kind of touched upon that, but can you elaborate a little bit more? What's in it for China? What's in it for Russia? And, you know, I can understand the US and the Europeans and the other allies, but really, there is enough science and engineering and gain to be made from this project that, you know, people with diametrically opposite ideological colors have come together to do this.
Yeah, you know, it's such a great question, and I feel that the best answer that I could give you is almost an emotional one. What do they hope to gain? They hope to gain peace. Now, that may be a radical statement, but let me explain what I mean. We have other challenges. We have just gone through the pandemic of COVID-19. We have, at times, trade wars, yes, ideological differences, even military conflicts. We have certainly illustrated financial differences and transactions, and even insecurities that occur with cybersecurity in our now very, very digital world. We also are facing the specter of climate change. And I would argue that one thing that all of these countries are hoping to gain from ITER is a demonstration that for these kinds of challenges that transcend borders, that regardless of ideology, my failure will affect your safety and security and human security as well. These approaches are all threats that we must find a way to collaborate in order to achieve our own survival as a species, arguably. And so I would say that there is a vision. And I have colleagues from all of those countries who work with me here, and I am able to say in that way that, and I can guarantee you, it is a shared vision that ITER as the way will also serve as a model for how we can set aside our differences enough to collaborate on issues that will affect not just me, but the legacy that I give to my daughter as an inheritance, and that we give to many generations who will follow. There's something hilariously different about fusion. And I love it because it's the name also. Fusion would imply coming together.
That's right.
In the 1950s, you referred to this history earlier. There was a lonely, many people at that, well, so let's go even further back. If you go back 100 years, there are French and German scientists who were coming up with the idea, and English scientists coming up with the idea of how fusion operated at the core of the sun and the stars back as far as 1919, 1920. We're at about the 100th anniversary. But practical ways of illustrating that were actually going in many, many different directions in different countries. And there was a Soviet soldier stationed by himself on Sakhalin Island who was a physics nut, and he had nothing but textbooks. He didn't have formal education in physics. And he came up with the idea of this toroidal shape in which the velocity could be taken, of the particles could be taken to such an extent that they would collide and fuse. Now he was looking not at magnetized confinement, but static confinement, but bar that, he's the one that came up with that shape, and he sent it to Stalin. And of course, Stalin had no idea what to do with it, but he gave it to his, Sakharov and his top scientists, and they came up with this idea of this might actually be feasible, and they worked on it, and they worked more, and they got to a point where now we're talking about 1958, the end of the 50s, where they presented a paper that is still remarkable to me, because they didn't present it, they presented it to their Cold War enemies. By this time, we're talking about Khrushchev going with Kurchatov. That Igor Kurchatov was the scientist, and when it presented a paper that by all means should have been confidential in every way, because every human endeavor we have done since we were in caves was, if we made a technological advance, our first question is, how can I help myself? How can I help my family, my clan, my allies, my country? And they went and shared it. So they shared this information. And of course, the British and later the Americans hearing about it, deeply skeptical. Why would they even share this? But at the margins of these Geneva conferences for peace, this started to be a topic. Of course, scientific diplomacy, scientists discussing the possibilities. And roughly 10 years later, they presented another paper, this time at a conference in still the Soviet Union, at which T1, Tokamak 1 had been followed by Tokamak 2 and Tokamak 3. And in T3, they had achieved 10 million degrees. Nobody had ever gotten close to that. Nobody had ever been close to representing that escalation that said, if we keep going in this direction and make it better and better, we will get to that temperature necessary for fusion. So at that stage, the Russians actually said to the British, you're better at measurement. Why don't you come back with your measuring instruments to our laboratory and verify our conclusions? And that was the beginning of international collaboration. And you could look at many other tokamaks. You could look at D3D in San Diego. You can look at the Princeton Plasma Physics Laboratory, PPPL. You can look at the Stellarator, a twisted version of a tokamak, in Wendelstein 7X in Germany, or K-Star in Korea, or some that you're hearing about, East in China, West, just a kilometer or two from me here in France. You can look at many of these. And what you will find is that almost without exception, they are populated by international scientists, and they are sharing the information. So fusion has this strange brainchild that says, we want to collaborate. And part of it, in fairness, is because it's really hard. Part of it, if you ask, coming back to your question, what do they all hope to gain from ITER? The idealistic answer, which I've given, is collaboration. But the hard as nails truth answer is also, because we are going to gain from this the engineering demonstration. So of course we want to build the experimental device, but right now, all of the intellectual property coming out that says, how do you build a magnet that is 17 meters in its longest dimension, and it needs to be super cool dimension, needs to be super conducting to make the magnetic field. How do I make that in a way that it will have a precision in the range of millimeters, sometimes under a millimeter? Why? Because the magnetic field that we described has to be very, very tightly woven, like the weave of your jacket. It has to be so tight that a proton, a charged proton, cannot escape that field. Because otherwise, if you don't have an efficiently woven magnetic field, not only will you bombard the steel walls with these particles, in addition, you won't get to the fusion reaction because you have to contain and shape and mold that plasma in order to get to this magic Q that you want to get to, this much higher output than input. So that's a long answer to your question again.
Well, that's a very important answer. And, you know, as you talk, I mean, I get so excited about every sentence that comes out of your mouth that, you know, although you're giving me very good answers, but, you know, that raises many more questions. But, you know, I'm trying to contain my enthusiasm and keep ourselves within the jurisdiction of the 2 hour that I asked you to commit to this interview. And, you know, you made a reference to this Q factor or the gain factor. And that's a number that, you know, characterizes the performance of the power plants, which, as you explained, is the ratio of the output power to the input power. Actually, this Q number or the gain factor is something that engineers use for the output of engines that they design in the car engines. And ITER, and you mentioned that ITER has a gain factor of 10, which is, I mean, you're hoping that it should have a gain factor of 10 because no tokamak has ever been able to produce a gain factor like that. How does that compare with other modes? I mean, I know you compared it with other tokamak reactors in the past, but how does that gain factor compares to other modes of power generation like hydroelectrics and gas turbine and nuclear fission to which you referred? And what is the limit of power generation by a single fission reactor? Is there a limit, or is 10 the limit? Could we possibly one day generate the power required by a small country of, let's say, 10 million, the size of Sweden or Israel, by a single fission power plant?
The simple answer is yes. Size theoretically is unlimited. It's limited by engineering. It's not limited by the science. So as long as you can build it, it will function. Now, you know, when I say that, let me get back to your comparison issues. You know, the efficiencies that we get out of a tremendous engine, the best engines, and they're married, you know, ranging from the internal combustion engine to turbos and many other kinds of things that we use, or a jet engine. You know, those efficiencies are measured always in gains that are much smaller. I'll give you an example. 1 gram of a fusion fuel, the combined deuterium tritium, is roughly the equivalent of 10,000 tons of coal. So 10 million kilos, right? So that then, if you start to go even further to renewable energy, solar energy, we hear quite a lot these days about solar plants and how solar and wind are becoming cheaper and cheaper, and arguably in some journals you will read they are the cheapest form of electricity. It's not my business at all to trash renewables. I am an enormous fan of renewable energy, and I think that in the perfect world of the future, when you're asking how could we power a country or a city or other things, you would be envisioning a combination. My perfect vision would be a combination of renewables and fusion. Why? Because both are essentially powered by either the natural processes, indirectly powered by the sun, which is also fusion, or you're talking about a highly concentrated energy. But it is really important to be realistic about renewables. And the simplest comparison is that they are using fusion energy at a distance, as you said, hundreds of millions of kilometers from the sun. So that means that they are extraordinarily diffuse. And I believe, you hear that critics of renewables complain about the intermittency, the storage capacity that they require, et cetera, but at their heart, they're just not concentrated. So the reason that we have been addicted to petroleum fuels for so long is both because they represent a battery. In other words, they represent the accumulated energy of dead plants and organic matter that has been compressed and compressed and compressed over millennia. So we are taking essentially that stored energy like a battery, originally driven from the sun. Those plants, that life got compressed, and we are taking that out, but it's so versatile. You can burn petroleum in a lamp, in a kerosene lamp. You can burn petroleum in your car. You can put it into something very, very tiny. You can put it into something very macro. So petroleum's got this unbelievable versatility. And if we're going to replace it, if we're going to save the world not only from the pollution, but the climate change caused by taking petroleum waste and deliberately for 150 years doing what we would never do with nuclear waste, nuclear fission waste. Nuclear fission waste terrifies us. We want to put it in, vitrified cylinders and store it in underground caverns for, tens of thousands of years. But the petroleum waste, we see it coming out of our exhaust, but then we filter it and we don't see it, and we're just discharging that directly into the atmosphere. So great things about petroleum. It has served us very well. It has driven the last 150 years of the Industrial Revolution. It's powered our lifestyles. It's why we've got iPhones and the ability to hold this interview remotely. But that said, we know we desperately need a clean energy source. So that will mean that we will get to a combination of, I believe, renewables for those countries that accept fission, and it's got these public acceptance issues and so forth. But for those countries that accept fission, France, where I live, is one. 70-something% of our electricity in France is absolutely clean. We can easily start to achieve our clean climate goals. Why? Because we're using fission, and fission releases no carbon into the atmosphere. However, because of the safety and waste concerns, many countries don't want to accept it. So maybe that will end up being a bridge. But fusion would be able to be built, I said as large as you want. My recommendation, if you take a country of, you said, I think, a country, for example, a country of say 10 million inhabitants, or even smaller, because this is easier to illustrate. If you take a city like Washington, D.C., or a country that has a similar number, about 6 million people in Metro D.C., you would normally need something on the order of 6 gigawatts of electricity at our current consumption rates. Now, there's a trick in that. I'm going to come back to that later. But at current consumption rates of electricity across the US, you'd need about 3 plants, each at about 3 fusion plants, each at about 2 gigawatts, right? So if you made the power output about 2,500 and the plant itself used about 500, you would have a net gain of about 2,000. And yes, the Q factor with greater volume or greater strength of magnetic field can be much, much higher. And so colleagues at Massachusetts Institute of Technology or in the UK, a company called Tokamak Energy, they're working on fusion reactors that will try to scale up the ability for, quote, high temperature superconductors, which will give you, they're yttrium based. They're a compound that's more like a tape than a coil, but doesn't matter. If they're successful at scaling up, which there's no reason to think they will not be, you will be able to get even a greater, maybe double the magnetic field strength. And then you'll have to figure out the materials science for the bombardment of the walls to be even stronger than what we would get at ITER with the field strength. But getting back to DC, rather than building one 6 gigawatt, 6,000 megawatt fusion plant, you would want to do several. Why? Because depending on what grid you're going to connect to, you will have periods of outage. So fusion will run continuously as a fossil fuel plant or a fission plant will run. But you talk about some periods of downtime for maintenance where you have to change out components. There's no need to refuel like with a fission plant, but you will be taking the helium, accumulated helium, what we call ash. It doesn't look like ash, but it's the helium after it's lost its energy. You'll need to take that out of the base of the tokamak and put empty cartridges in there. So there is maintenance, and it will be robotic, so it will be efficient, but the operational time, I would venture to say, would probably be in the 90 to 95% time. But you do not want to have in that period a shutdown of all of your country or all of your cities electrical power. So you would stagger that as we do it now with multiple plants online. But that's about how much you would need for a country of that sort.
So I hear that from the engineering and feasibility point of view, it's possible, but from practical point of view of the convenience and the possibility of the security, safety, and the possibility of interruption and disruption to the service, it's better to build it in the form of multiple
several smaller
plants. That's right.
I would make a caveat though, so that I should have finished one other point. In the US right now, electricity makes up in the range of 25% of our primary energy consumption, right? So when you hear people say that 10% of US energy is coming from renewables, that's actually not accurate. It's 10% of electricity. And if electricity is 25% of overall power supply or overall energy the consumption, then renewables are about 2.5% of the overall consumption. So what is the other consumption? That includes much of your transportation. If you decide that Biden's mandate of setting, by such and such date, we have to have all electrical vehicles, then that means that you will need more electricity, because right now we're fueling that with petroleum, right? So the more that you use end use as electricity, the more you will need. What about our tankers? What about our military, our ships? What about all of the transport vehicles, both planes and these giant ocean-bearing vessels that bring our much coveted goods from wherever they're manufactured around the world? Those also are nearly 100% powered by petroleum. So if you're going to replace that, it probably won't be electricity. It will probably be hydrogen fuel cells. So now you've gotten even more inefficient, because hydrogen, although it's touted as a green fuel, hydrogen is not a fuel. It does not exist raw in nature. It exists in combination, such as in H2O in water. So if you use the most common method, you will use electrolysis to split the water, make hydrogen. But the electrolysis means you use electricity, which means you had to have a primary fuel, whether that's renewables or coal or oil or fusion. So if you're now going to make a hydrogen fuel cell to run the tanker that brings your goods from China, or to run the vessel that brings your goods from China, then that means that you have to consider the efficiency of an original source of electricity that is used in electrolysis to produce the splitting that gives you the hydrogen fuel. And now you're going to take that hydrogen fuel and use it in a fuel cell. So you've lost some degree of efficiency with all of that. So if we now say that we're going to replace the 75% of primary US energy consumption that is not now electricity, but it's maybe oil heating, it's agriculture, it's transportation, it's all these other uses. And right now we're using oil or gasoline or whatever because it's so easy and handy and efficient. So if we start to do that, we will need to make much, much more electricity. So we come back to our illustration of Washington, D.C., then it may be that you don't need the current amount, which is 6 gigawatts of electricity supply. Take that, maybe that now is 24 gigawatts, or maybe because of its inefficiency, it's even more than that you need, that we need all of this electricity to power. And if you get up to 24 gigawatts, then yes, maybe the size of your fusion plants would be 6 gigawatts each, right? So all of those factors will go into determining the most practical answer to your question in our clean fusion powered future.
That's remarkable. Actually, you kind of use the word splitting both in the case of electrolysis and in the case of fission. And I just want to make it clear to our audience that you're referring to, when you're talking about fission, you're talking about splitting of the nucleus. And when you're talking about electrolysis, you're talking about the chemical process that's separation of hydrogen and oxygen. That can happen at much lower cost than nuclear case, the nuclear splitting. And one point that came to my mind when we were talking about the motivations of these various countries for coming together on this particular project is because it seems to me, Laban, that fusion doesn't lend itself to miniaturization, but fission does, and converting nuclear energy, fission or fusion, into illicit purposes like nuclear weapons, one of the main requirements of miniaturization, because you need to deliver this thing to somewhere else. You don't want it to explode where you're launching it, right? So there is, as I understand it, the bigger these tokamak reactors are, the bigger energy they produce, which means they're going exactly in the opposite to the direction of miniaturization. And they, at least as they stand, as the science and engineering and technology stands, it doesn't really lend itself to miniaturization. So it's safe to say that it will not, for a long time, it will never be used for military purposes or for anything but peaceful energy production purposes, which is remarkable that, there's a technology that inherently is good and there is nothing evil about it. And even that really is so advantageous about this particular technology. In earlier you referred to the European, the joint European thermonuclear experiment of JET, which, if I remember correctly, it was built in 1983, and with half the power generation capability of ITER. And the main purpose of building it was to be used as a test bed for the development of ITER. For example, the jet plasma vessel walls are made of beryllium and tungsten, as will be the case for ITER. And please correct me if I'm wrong. Could you tell us a bit about JET and how it really helped for the science and engineering technology that eventually justified ITER?
Sure. I am not in any sense an expert on JET. I have a lot of colleagues at ITER that came from there. And yet what I would say, first of all, yeah, the size is different, but the thing that JET did was demonstrated, for one thing, the feasibility of, for example, these beryllium walls to breed tritium, the tungsten as a material that would work as in its ability to withstand extreme heat, because as I mentioned, even though you've got this magnetic field holding things away from the walls, this helium ash over time decays. So at the very, very bottom of ITER, you have this, at the bottom of the tokamak, you have this thing called a diverter. A diverter just means that's where the quote, quote, gravity settling ash diverts to and is collected. So they're little modules that will be able to be taken out robotically and exchanged. JET demonstrated this. It demonstrated the efficacy of some of the materials. It also demonstrated that deuterium-tritium fusion worked at a scale that was higher than anything else had ever been attempted. So that allowed you to take all of your computer simulations and your calculations that had been done on many, plotted tokamak by tokamak to watch the graph of efficiency get higher and higher. It demonstrated conclusively the continuation of that efficiency gain. So even though it didn't break even, it showed that the graph and the calculations and everything else were correct. That's very important. It also produced a tremendous amount of the design expertise, the manufacturing expertise, et cetera, that led to ITER. So it's very easy for scientists to focus on ITER as their plaything. This is going to be this largest experimental device ever in the history of humans, and that's true. But it is also in this engineering phase where we are demonstrating, as I said earlier, that you can make these giant components at the necessary levels of precision. And had we not had JET, it would have been more difficult because it's bigger than some of these others, such as EAST or K-STAR or others, experimental plants, JT60SA in Japan. So there's that. There's also, because it has configurations and materials and other things that are very similar to ITER, it serves very well as a test bed. So one of the things that the US is assigned to procure on behalf of ITER, and I intimated this over and over, but I should have said back in the before 2010, say the 2005 to 2008 timeframe, when countries were deliberating how they would build ITER, one of the things that sets it apart from any experiment ever done is that they decided that they would break down the machine into components and every country would build some. So rather than handing, 20 billion euros to Siemens or Areva or Westinghouse or some other nuclear, large plant giant, they wanted for contributions to be largely in kind. So Europe, as the host, makes 45% of the overall financial contribution to ITER, and each of the other countries, US, India, Russia, et cetera, contribute 9%, but they do it in the form of components. And so for most, that's in the range of 90%, maybe the US a little bit less, but it's about 90% of the contribution is not cash given to France, not cash given to the ITER organization, it's components. So putting all that together, one of the things that the US is supposed to contribute as part of its component contribution is what we call pellet injection. So this is an enormously challenging aspect that allows you to control the plasma. When you have any sort of distortion of this shape, you have to be able to control that in this microsecond. It's again, as with many of the technical specifications for ITER, it's an insanely challenging engineering parameter. JET allows the US to take the pellet injection designs that they've been making, send them over to the UK with US scientists and so forth, and they're able to test the efficacy of pellet injection in the JET plasma. So in that way, for expertise, for materials, for light configurations, JET is really a wonderful precursor.
I think, we've talked a great deal of very complex process, science, engineering, technology, planning, financing, economics, and even politics. And I think that at this point, it would help our audience with a better understanding of the uniqueness of ITER and everything that we've said so far. If you could share with us a video or a photo tour of the facility and a brief history of construction of the plant and manufacturing and shipment of various parts from different countries, because I know that some of these parts are so enormous that you must have had special provision for the supply chain, so to speak, for all these parts to arrive in a timely manner and be able to assemble them then.
Yeah, so I will be happy to try to share my screen here and give you this tour of ITER. Can you,
yes,
are you able
can.
to see my screen?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so let's go here. This is what you're seeing here is a bird's eye view of ITER world. Break in at any time if you have questions, but I'm going to minimize you and go directly into what you're seeing an overview of the ITER worksite. And despite the skill of this photographer's lens, no, we do not occupy that much of the world. But if you look at the aerial view of ITER, you will see here that we are situated in the mountains. It is for someone who wants to come from all these countries around the world. We're living here in Provence, so we're close to the Petit Luberon and the other mountain ranges that surround the ITER facility. And if you look at the facility itself, what you see is that I'm actually talking to you right here. I'm sitting right there in this headquarters building. Mm-hmm. And the site itself is about 1 kilometer long and about 400 meters wide, not counting this facility here, the storage facility where a lot of things come in and are stored, the smaller components. The bigger components come up the road from Marseille, and they make their way all the way to the ITER site along about 104 kilometer itinerary from countries all over the world. And they come through these roads and
so you're
eventually
104 kilometers away from Marseille, and you're halfway
exactly.
between Nice and Montpellier.
More or less, yeah, that's exactly correct. That's exactly correct, in the heart of Provence.
Yes.
And so it's a lovely place to live when you have the time.
I envy you, Laban. I envy you.
Thank you. Thank you. It was easy to talk my wife into moving from New York to ITER. So
well, New York is too shabby neither, Laban.
New York is wonderful, no question. But knowing that we were going to be in Provence, I think softened the blow. But these components come in, And if they're big, they're stored. Sometimes they have additional conditioning and so forth. I'll talk to you about some of those in a moment. But they will essentially enter here eventually into a cleaning building, then an assembly hall, and then this is really the heart of the whole overall ITER facility, where the tokamak, the ITER reactor, will be housed. And I will try to take you into some of these buildings, but what you're really seeing here is that all of this entire site is either manufacturing facilities, 2 manufacturing facilities. Everything else is support systems that will drive this reactor or the experimentation. So first, since I'm talking to you in the US, let me start with the US contribution. And there will be many US contributions because this is a very complex very large Lego puzzle, if you like. But here, what you're seeing is I took you to the other end of the facility, and you have here the electrical switch yard. And there are really 2 overall electrical systems. So the transformers that you see here, these transformers are all supplied by the US, as is much of the electrical equipment in what we call the steady state electrical network. And by that term, it just means it's the normal industrial network that you would have at any industrial facility, or for that matter, for a city. This is the kind of thing that you have full of transformers and so forth that power your electrical grid with AC alternating current. Here, you have roughly a hectare. Again, you've got transformers, but these are coming from China. And this is what's going to make up what we call the pulsed power electrical network. And so you've got about a hectare of equipment, some of it from China, some of it from other contributors, which I'll mention in a bit, that is creating the ability to deliver a gigantic pulse, 450 megawatts, but only for a microsecond, that you use just at the very, very start. It is not a continuous. There are some that make the mistake that think that means we can't be efficient with ITER. No, you store this power up very quickly, and then you hold it. So this entire system sort of acts like a giant capacitor in its ability to drive the initial pulse of for a microsecond of the electricity needed by these giant electromagnets. Now, I'm going to be showing you some of these magnets that are actually completed, but some of them, many of them, come from all over the world. They come from, we have magnets being made in China, in Italy, in Japan, in the US, in San Diego, et cetera. But some are simply too big to ship, and other components we have that are too big to ship. So I will eventually take you to this building, which is owned by India. I'll explain why. And this one, red striped building, owned by the European Union. In this case, where they are making some of the magnets that are simply too big. Now, where I want to take you next is, where does this pulse? Oh, and I should say, because we won't come back to this, that all of these buildings are where either the ITER construction team lives, or their this is a parking lot, but where their contractors live. We have in total about I think we're over 1,000 ITER staff now, plus what we call ITER project associates, which are seconded staff from the domestic agencies in every ITER member country. And we also have contractors, both contractors for the domestic agencies that are building the buildings or other things, and contractors that are the ITER organization's own. So in total here, we have about 4,000 people on the ITER overall site. About 2,500 of those are workers, and that number is still creeping up. It will get up to about 3,000 total that are just on the worksite portion, not on the support facilities, but just on the worksite portion. So you can imagine what this was like when COVID hit in March of last year in France, and suddenly we were supposed to be going into lockdown. And as complex as this organization is, I'm going to be showing you how components from all over the world arriving makes for an extremely complex schedule. And if one factory shuts down, it doesn't just impact the completion of that component. If it impacts the arrival, what is there, and that machine has to be assembled in a particular sequence, what is all that going to do to the schedule of everybody else? Does everybody else put their device into storage? Does that mean they have to account for maybe new corrosion mechanisms or storage costs? So it's a very, very intricately connected project. And as managers, we were faced with this question: what do we do? Do we follow the French national ruling and everybody goes to remote working? Do we take our chances and risk a giant COVID outbreak? Because we've got people coming here from all over the world. So, we were determined we would not be a mechanism. And in fact, before masks were generally available everywhere, our Chinese counterparts sent us a gigantic shipment of masks, because we had taken and later Korea did the same thing, because we had taken the decision we would not shut down. We got as low as about 700, maybe 800 people on a given day. That was our lowest point, but we never stopped. And our project productivity, which goes, we monitor about 25,000 tasks every 2 months, and each one is weighted. That goes from design to fabrication to system building to construction to installation and system commissioning. So that allows us to say with authority every 2 months, this is how far we are in the ITER project. Right now we're at 75%. At that stage, we were much further behind. And so that means we have to make a progress of about 0.7% per month in order to meet the goal of a completed first functional test of the machine in December 2025. So we've had delays, but we couldn't stop. So that 0.7% per month got down to as low as about 0.4% per month. But if you look at what we've been doing as we go inside these buildings, you'll recognize that it was in fact a Herculean task. There has never, I am of course prejudiced, I will admit this because I work here, but I would be hard pressed to find any complex project management achievement that equals what the ITER project did in the face of the last 18 months of COVID-19 coronavirus. And from March 15th, when we went into lockdown and continued, through the end of August, where we had started assembly and all of these giant components that I'm going to show you had begun to arrive, we did not have a single infection on the COVID worksite, not a single transmission. And we started to refer to it as the ITER miracle. And to be honest, we have now had we've had some, I think our peak week, we had something like 25 cases. But for that number of people and how amazingly the coronavirus was spreading in Provence, it was nothing. And now with the Delta variant spreading, we are still doing things that are more strict than what the French government is doing for shopping malls and so forth, because we are determined we will keep, even under the Delta variant, with most of our people vaccinated, we will keep this as COVID-free as possible. So let's go into these buildings next. This is when the electricity coming from the pulsed power network is being transferred from AC power into DC power inside what we call magnet power conversion buildings. That's these two. They're relatively identical. So when you go there, you will see in the out forms, the bays in the outside of this building, you will see that some of the equipment is being installed outside. Some of it, and this is equipment that must also include not what is here, but what is received and what goes in to this building where the magnets will be. And this building, which you see is less complete, which I'll get to at some point, it's the diagnostics building. I'll come to that. But if you go inside these buildings and consider all of the equipment, it's actually now equipment that is coming from not only China, but also Korea, India, and Russia. And so inside this building, what you have, to put it crudely, these are giant extension cords. These are basically bus bars, as we call them, which were shipped in the middle of the COVID lockdown across in giant truckloads, shipped over land from Russia through the middle of all of the lockdown and everything going on in Europe. None of these were here. They're now largely, not completely, but they're largely installed both in these buildings and in the tokamak building. And then you have transducers, and you have equipment for which I'm not an electrical engineer, so I can't even tell you all of the different pieces of equipment that we have sitting inside these buildings, some still in wraps, just arrived, some freshly installed, that will all be part of what is essentially a very, very complex electrical device. Now, remember, not only are the magnets taking a lot of electrical power, they are also taking this super cooling, because they have to be superconducting, which means we have to take them down to this temperature of minus 265 degrees. So we were just in these buildings. Right next to them is this two buildings that make up the cryogenics facility. Now, CERN also use superconducting magnets, and they also use supercooling. These tanks are either liquid nitrogen or liquid helium. So liquid nitrogen will do some intermittent cooling. Liquid helium is what will actually take you down to this temperature of 4 degrees Kelvin, minus 269 degrees. So if you took every plant, every experiment at CERN and put it all together, it would be slightly larger. This is the Large Hadron Collider, everything. It would be slightly larger than the ITER facility. But ITER is the largest single platform cryogenics facility ever made. It will circulate 25,000 tons of liquid helium. So going inside.
Do you actually liquefy helium on site, or do you purchase liquid helium?
No. We purchase the helium, but we don't manufacture the helium. Our system also, that 25,000 metric tons, as you know, helium is a very precious resource. So
yes,
we don't plan to restock. This is a leak-free facility.
Mm-hmm.
We have to make this leak tight, but we take the incoming helium gas,
mm-hmm.
and we in these facilities we turn that into liquid helium. Mm-hmm. If you go inside those plants, what you will see is, again, to put it crudely, it's like opening the back of your refrigerator, mm-hmm. and you will just see quite a ton of compressors, wow. and pumps and valves, all designed to get you from incoming bottles, very large bottles of hydrogen helium gas, to making it liquid helium at minus 269 degrees. So that's what you're going to find inside these facilities: mm-hmm. compressors, valves, pumps, tanks, etc. Now, before we go further into the actual facility, before we I'm eventually going to take you, as I said, the components go into this cleaning building and into the assembly hall, and eventually into the tokamak. Before we go into all of this, I want to talk about two systems where I cannot, because there's not really much to see. I can't take you inside, or it's not really practical. So here you have the radio frequency building. Mm-hmm. So ITER will have three types of heating systems: the ion cyclotron heating system, the gyrotron heating system, and one that is not going to be here for the first functional test, what we call the neutral beam facility. That is being made at full scale in Italy, and they are testing at a full ITER scale, and then that will be translated. It will be installed here. It's hard to see it without a top-down view, but it's on the other side of the tokamak complex. But these two heating systems will be available for first plasma. First plasma in December 2025, and likely because of COVID slowdown, we will have some delays. We're examining that. We'll present a new baseline to the board, to the ITER Council, our governing body, in November, and then in the intermittent time that the council meets twice a year. So between November and June 2022, they will do an external review to say that the new baseline is correct and acceptable to all members, et cetera, and then they will presumably ratify that in June 2022. So that means we will probably not make the 2025 December first plasma date, but we are exhibiting remarkable resilience. We have taken delays of 18 months and boiled them down to 6, and even in some cases 4 months and less. The different cultures, it is fascinating to watch the difference between Chinese project management and Russian and European and American and Japanese and Indian project management. Each really has its own culture. And when we do it well, that means we learn from each other because each one brings its own strength. But these gyrotrons are manufactured in Japan and Russia and the European Union and so forth. And then here you have the ITER. It looks small, but it's a gigantic stark, brutal sort of architecture. It's just a big heat exchanger. Much of that made by India. And there are these giant pipes here. And this is where you would normally have a turbine generator. If we were going to produce electricity, we'd shoot it from here and then run it across back to the grid. But instead, we need to have all the capacity to absorb the heat from ITER. So you have this, I mentioned, 500 megawatts that we might take as high as 750. So we've got a 1.2 gigawatt capacity to remove heat from the facility, right? So these pipes are here and then they run underground and they take the heat directly from the tokamak. Not that interesting to go into, but important to know for an understanding of the overall function. Mm-hmm. I would also mention that here you have storage for these temporary components and this rather strange looking thing. This is a cocoon, which is going around something that I'm going to explain a bit later. Inside this facility, this is one of the factories. It is the only factory owned by India. So India was tasked with making an overall sort of thermos that surrounds the entire tokamak. So it is literally the biggest component because it's got to hold everything. And obviously, if this is going to be 30 meters in diameter, and I don't know the combined weight, but the combined weight is probably something in the range of 3,000 tons. There was no way India could ship that. It is envisioned that they would make it in four components. So a base, a circle that's the next part of the cylinder, an upper cylinder, a lower cylinder, an upper cylinder, and a crown, a lid, right? So the first two, the base and the lower cylinder, are installed already in this building inside the ITER tokamak. The upper cylinder is stored here. Now, doesn't look very remarkable. That's just a piece of steel stored, for corrosion purposes, an Indian component stored inside a Dutch-made cocoon. But why is it remarkable? First, it's remarkable because this could not be shipped. So it had to be made inside this cryostat workshop, this Indian manufacturing facility. Secondly, that doesn't look very big, right? But to give you a sense of scale, this is roughly the size of Stonehenge. Wow. The circle of sarsen stones.
Yeah, I can say from those trucks on the ground.
You see the size of the trucks and suddenly you realize, wow, this is incredible. And it's also sort of, I think, mythical because nobody exactly knows what the people at Stonehenge were trying to do those thousands of years ago. But we do surmise from the way the sarsen stones are aligned that they were trying in some way to align themselves to external events. And so they were in some way trying to harness the power of the sun, maybe mythically or mystically all the way back then. But here we are recreating the same sort of power that these folks were trying to replicate in a much more physical way now, these thousands of years later. So we're following
that little cylinder, not little, giant cylinder over there was built inside the building and was transported outside the building. Was it built in one piece, or you said how was it taken out of the building?
Yeah, so this is a little bit perspective. So this cylinder is the same dimension as this door. This door is just larger than the diameter of the cylinder. The cylinder was built in here. Let's go inside this building, the cryostat, and actually have a look at what. So this is the building. This is the storage, and now you see the scale. You can see that it's a little bit better proportioned here.
Yes, yes.
Right. So if we go inside this building, we can see them working on the top, the last component. I will show you later the bottom two pieces, the lower cylinder and the base. This is the lid. So the lid, what you can see here, the lid is arriving in these segments. You see it's missing a segment. That's because you could not possibly ship these things from India, where they are made in these. I visited this giant forging facility, and it's one of these, you know, the amazing capacity that India brings to the project is that they are still able to manufacture these high precision pieces of steel. In this case, you can see the steel has a curve. And so what they're actually doing, now we're at eye level, this is the missing piece of the facility. So, or of the tokamak lid. And the human aspect is equally remarkable, because here in the cryostat workshop, India was entrusted by the ITER project to develop what they call the cryostat, not cryogenics, but cryostat. So a static component that would be able to hold the tokamak inside a light volume, not the heavy volume of the vacuum vessel, but a light volume, and a light vacuum, sorry, and at a relatively cool temperature, not cool to cryogenic temperatures, just a relatively cool temperature to minimize the heat load of other components. So this inability to ship and the international aspect, where the Indian welders, very good welders, were certified according to Indian standards, which in this case were not by certification process. It's a different standard than the European standard. And of course, the French insisted, because this is a nuclear facility under nuclear regulation in France, so we had to have European certification. So what do we have? Here we have a crack team of German welders, the company's called MAN, under Indian supervision, under French nuclear regulation, on an international facility, piecing together 54 pieces. You can see the weld lines, 54 pieces of precisely manufactured steel into an overall component that will be made up of 4 giant subcomponents: the base, the lower cylinder, the upper cylinder, and the lid. So that gives you another illustration of the international collaboration involved.
And that cap is made of stainless steel?
Yeah, it's a precise designed for purpose stainless steel. Yeah, a European designed austenitic stainless steel that was transferred to India for the forging. Now, next we're going to go into one more manufacturing facility, and then I will take you into this holy of holies where we assemble and make the assembly, the ITER machine, the tokamak. But first, here inside the
I think we lost your video.
Yeah, I'm not sure why. I will do a little backtrack, but I'm not exactly sure what happened here with the.
You have your voice. Your voice is perfect. If you want to continue with the presentation without the video, or if you can fix it quickly.
Yeah, I will try. I mean, I will go back to an earlier place so that your friends can process that properly, but I'm not really sure what happened here. Give me just a few minutes here, okay?
Okay, that's okay. Take your time.